After I graduated from Hillsdale College in 1994, I headed west to Claremont, California, to study for my PhD in political science at the Claremont Graduate School. It was there I met our next speaker and his lovely wife, Penny. At the time, he was president of the Claremont Institute, which, as you know, he was president of for 15 years before coming to Hillsdale. He didn't offer any formal classes back then, as he does now, but he did a lot of teaching informally in his speeches and in our many conversations. And in addition to learning from him, I learned something about him, which is that if you claim to know something in his presence, it makes you something of a ripe target, especially when you're a young student like I was. As any good teacher does, he wasn't afraid to tell us when we were wrong, which he did, to me at least, quite frequently. Well, if you come and see us on campus in Hillsdale, and we hope you will, and you sit in on one of his classes or have lunch with him in the student dining hall, what you'll see is that he hasn't changed a bit. At Hillsdale, he teaches courses on various topics now in the classroom, including the Constitution, Aristotle, and C.S. Lewis, and he's the author of several books, including the best-selling Churchill's Trial, Winston Churchill and the Salvation of Free Government. His topic today is Conservatism and American Greatness. Please welcome back to the podium the 12th president of Hillsdale College, Larry P. Arnn.
Thank you, Tim. Good morning. Thanks for coming. Tim is like Doug Jeffrey. He's been a colleague of mine so long I can't remember when it started anymore. He's all grown up now and has children. Kim Strassel was great last night. I can't fire John Miller, but I want to. If you come to visit Hillsdale College, call my office and find out if it's a week when I'm in town. Come such a week. And the thing is, I go eat in the dining hall every day and sit with the students and kick the crap out of them. And you can come with me and help. You'll like it. It's fun. It's the best sport on earth. Okay, so I'm going to talk about conservatism and American greatness, and what that topic suggests at the outset is there's a split in the conservative movement about Donald Trump, and I will talk about that a little bit at the end. But first, I'm going to do what we academics do, define what the terms are. And there are three in this title that Doug Jeffrey has ordered me to address. Conservative, what's that? America, what's that? And what's greatness? Those are rich terms. It's fun to know what they mean. The word conservative comes from two Latin words, confederation, convocation, means with, something together. And keep, the other Latin word is to keep. So conservatism means to keep things together. And if you think about that for a minute, it means it can't really be a fundamental term. It's not about the being of a thing. Anything, any group of things could be kept together, and that means those things would have to already be in being. It's not about making anything. Those things are already in being. So conservatism is an inclination or a wish to keep things together, and of course it then depends very much on what the things are. Conservatives, and I'm one, we have an inclination to think that things that have been regarded highly for a long time or performed well for a long time have stood a test, and it's easier to tell about those things. People are always asking me, because I happen to like Donald Trump, do I think he's like Winston Churchill? And, I always say, well, there are some important differences. And Trump represents change of a kind, right? And so we conservatives might well have an inclination against that. I did in the beginning. And on the other hand, it doesn't tell you enough to say that you're a conservative, because among the things that are very old are motherhood and prostitution. I'm for one of them. And since my wife is sitting in this room, you know which one I mean. Nazi Germany was a political regime. Churchill's Britain was a political regime. Turned out, couldn't both of them live? You had to pick. So you've got that problem in conservatism. American conservatism starts the thing we call the conservative movement today, of which I am supposed to be some kind of a leader. That started in the late 40s, early 50s, in resistance to something called progressivism that I'm going to define in a minute. And the question is, what was it for? And that has always been ambiguous. There's more than one strain of that. But let conservative mean for us right now an inclination to keep some things together, understanding that I won't have said anything that means very much unless I define what those things are. What's greatness? What does that mean? Can't it mean either largeness or excellence? And excellence is a very rich term, and it is a fundamental word. A synonym for it would be virtue. For a thing to be, America is big, and it might be important for it to be big. In fact, the people who started it before it was big thought it was important for it to be big. George Washington named the Revolutionary War American Army the Continental Army. But he didn't know how big the continent was. He didn't know during his lifetime. No emissary of the government of the United States made it to the Pacific back until Lewis and Clark in 1807 or 8. And he died in 1799, I think. Matt Spaulding's here, he can tell us. So bigness mattered, and you can see why it would matter for a country, because in a country, people have a right to make a living. And I'm going to talk about trade in a minute. Lincoln was a protectionist and Churchill was a free trader, and I love them both, but I'm a Churchill scholar. And I'll say something about that too and define some terms there. But the key to the American Revolution is not, we're going to be a whacking big old country, because they couldn't really be sure about that. And anyway, that wasn't the heart of the matter. It was that excellence part of the word great that matters. And what is it for a thing to be excellent? Excellence in a racehorse. They run really fast. In fact, I was talking to our trustee, Steve Van Andel, who's a polo player, except he just retired. And he was telling me about his horses. He's not going to play polo much anymore, but he's going to keep those horses because he loves them. And the reason he loves them is because they love. They love to play. They love to run. And the best of them, they really love to run. Just read stories or watch the movie about Secretariat or Seabiscuit, Those horses, they didn't just love to run. They loved to win. Made them racehorses. They were excellent racehorses. Secretariat, probably the best. An oak tree. Do you know about bonsai? What you do is trim roots and things on trees and try to make them perfect miniatures of the real thing, the full-grown thing. The Japanese take that to a high state. But of course, if you did that to an oak tree, you'd be taking away some of its essence, because those things are strong. An oak, a mighty oak, tall, leafy, great, an excellent oak tree. If you just look at two of them, the big, strong, well-proportioned one's the one you like. It has more about the oak tree in it than either any acorn or a little oak tree. What about a human being? What is it to be an excellent human being? Shakespeare has Mark Antony say of Brutus, and of course Mark Antony killed Brutus, but he was very sweet to him until he did that. He says of Brutus, he was gentle, and the elements so mixed up in him that nature could stand up and say to all the world, this was a man. All the elements of the man. What are they, right? They're a physical presence. They're, think about George Washington, you know, he was a very impressive man on a horse. Go watch that movie, Darkest Hour, and see Winston Churchill, who was a little short guy. In fact, he was exactly this height. I take comfort in that when I'm around Tim Caspar. Watch him in motion. Watch him talk. Watch him argue. Watch him move. See him on a battlefield. You know, he was very brave, like George Washington. Very brave, warlike men would see him on a battlefield and go, wow. He had a kind of calmness and deliberateness about it, a kind of perception about it that made him skillful in the fighting of war. Very lethal man. Sympathetic, beautiful of speech, and speech is the heart of the human being. That's what we do that makes us different from anybody else. And so when we meet people like that, what we think is, that's a great man. And what we mean is not large, we mean that's what a man is supposed to be. You know, my wife is a very fine person, and I know that from decades now of falling short. And that's what a woman should be. And you know, she's resilient, strong, brave, too, right? We all need that. We're human. What about in a country? How would you know when it's a great one? England was a monarchy during much of its greatest time, and an imperial nation. We've never been that. Rome was a republic and then an empire. The Greek city-states, they were awesome places, and they were just places in powerful ways, but they would look like despotisms to us today. Why? In one of the doctrines when you distinguish ancient political thought and ancient polises or polis from modern ones is, the modern rule is, in a decent country, what the law does not forbid, it permits. But in the Soviet Union in modern times, or in Sparta in ancient times, what the law does not permit, it forbids. You will spend your life living the life of a citizen of your state. And in the ancient world, because they were smaller and because it was connected to the gods and because there was some balance of power in the best of those cities, especially Sparta, that was not tyranny in the Soviet Union. That was just the appointing of some human beings to drive and manage others, according to a utopian goal that actually justified and granted limitless power. There are all kinds of regimes then, just like there are all kinds of horses and all kinds of people. And just like in people, the differences between one and another are greater than the difference between one horse and another. And the reason for that is because we are volitional creatures, that is to say, we have choice. We become agents in our own making in powerful ways. I'm in the college business, right? And you've seen there's a few students here. So far, they seem to be all girls. Maybe we're getting smarter about that, I don't know. But those two young men, just watch them. because that's my favorite age. I work with people like that. And what they are is huge potential. And then they grow a lot and mature a lot while they're here. And they become those poised and attractive and intelligent and seeing things that you see out there, right? And if they lived their lives a different way, they wouldn't get that. If they lived their lives as too many do today, crouched over a video screen all the time playing games, it'll stunt them. They won't know as much. They won't speak as well. They won't carry themselves as well. And they have a great deal to do with that. In fact, one of the rules that you have to learn to go into education is you don't teach them, they learn. At every moment that they learn, they have to be devoted to it. They have to be fully involved in it. Because otherwise, it's just what you know and you're just babbling on and they don't get any of it. That's one reason, by the way, why it's so important to ask them questions all the time. And equally important to disagree with what they say, even when you think it's right. Because first of all, it's fun. You couldn't believe it, right? Like, I always ask them what the good is. I'm about to get to that word, because that's the fundamental word. And it's the first and last question in philosophy. What is the good? Wonder what that is. And when you ask them that, I always ask them, it's very easy to steer the conversation to that, because if you ask them what they're doing and they tell you, and you ask them why, you never have to ask more than a couple more questions, and they'll say in some form or another that it's good. And although they know I'm going to ask that because they put cartoons about it in the college newspaper, they're always surprised when I say it. And then they think for a minute, and they roll their eyes, and then they repeat Aristotle's definition of the good, which I'll give you in a minute. And then, because they all know that I teach Aristotle and that is, in fact, the definition of the good, and they just repeat that, and then I disagree with it. And they go, oh, my God, Because the definition of the good is like the definition of the good racehorse, and like the definition of the good oak tree, and like the definition of the good human being, and I'll get to this, like the definition of the good nation. And that is each thing being fully and completely itself. That's why Mark Anthony's quote, because, as we say around, sometimes I'll say at the college, Winston Churchill was a pretty good statesman, Shakespeare was a pretty good writer. In fact, maybe the best ever. And when he puts that point, just think of the truth that's contained in that, because the elements have to be there, and they have to be there in the right arrangement and proportion and order, and then you get anything fully itself. When they say the good is a thing fulfilling its purpose and being fully itself, which is Aristotle's definition, I always say, good, then what about a murder? And then they go, oh my God, or I say, Hitler, very effective ruler, very good at being the kind, in fact, maybe the best. Stalin might have been better. At being the kind of thing it was. Well, you have to go a whole other step to get to that, because it turns out that evil is not a thing itself. It's the absence of something. Evil can only be understood by what it leaves out. If you look at a broken tree, if you look at a dying tree, it's the absence of the treeness that makes it bad. Hitler, the absence of the justice. And this is the larger meaning of greatness, right? It's actually like goodness, but especially in a country, it would have to include some element of mightiness, too. I always say, at Hillsdale, we're big free market types. Some of you were rustling during the last speech, and I'll give you some comfort in a minute. But you need to be strong. I'll always say we have at Hillsdale, lots of kids absorb the theory of non-interventionism. And their idea is that we Americans would never have to fear from anything abroad because we are here on this continent, and who's going to threaten us? And I always say, yeah, okay, but that can't be a theory, right? Because have you ever studied the history of Belgium? You know, it's hard duty to be Belgium. I think they're great people myself, right? But they just happen to be located by all those whacking big old powers, especially Germany. And Germany had a treaty, not only promising not to attack Belgium, but promising to defend Belgium if others attacked it. And meanwhile, they laid a railway, huge, with stops on it and loading places on it, specifically for the purpose of putting a big old army into Belgium, which they did twice, and they spent 20 years building that thing. So if you're poor little Belgium, what are you going to do, right? And the answer is, you're going to hope for Britain, France, and the United States to come help you. It's better to be one of them. Then you might be able to make it on your own. But that wouldn't be good enough because the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, they were huge and mighty. Probably the largest modern military ever built was the Red Army in World War II. And they took 3/4 of the Allied casualties and inflicted about that many on the Germans. And they were massive. But were they good? Good at killing Nazis. That's the only thing I know about them that's good. Is America great? And if so, what is its greatness? Well, that's a little hard to say if you can just step outside your own country and think about the others. All of the other great countries are very different from us. My wife's country, and beloved of me, England. Did you ever try to answer the question, when did that start? What about France? When did it start? What about Rome? What about Greece? What about China? You can talk about when modern China started. It started with the communist revolution, but maybe that's a different China for a reason I'm going to say. Our country is not a place, although it has always occupied a place and must occupy a place, but just think how much the place has changed. You know, that continent was unknown when they were laying claim to it in the revolution. Now it's known, and we have most of it. And that means that, was it America before we got it all? The answer is it was. It's not really a race, because the races, Lord help us, are not mixed up here in this country. How many of you are mongrels? Because I am, you know. My wife is too, kind of, because her father's side is Normans. You know, it means she's French. And very old, right? They can trace her lineage all the way back there, and that means my children's on their mother's side, on their mother's father's side. But my wife's mother is a Celt, right? And Lord, they might even be Vikings. So we're all mongrels, right? But what makes us what we are is that doesn't matter. And I will tell you, since we're not all a bunch of dukes and earls in this room, there's no single fact about America so important for us as that fact. This crisis that we're in right now, that Kim described very well, and with which I'm going to close, the only hope that we can overcome the massive force that has grown up behind this kind of government is the power of the principle that we may not be ruled except with our consent, and it doesn't matter who we are. That's there. That's a right or a truth that the claim has applied to every human being in the history of man. And it is the claim of this nation. and we have a birthday. It's not hard to name when the United States of America began. It began 77 years ago, backward from the Gettysburg Address to the year 1776. And in that year, the rights of all were proclaimed to be a purpose of a people. And that means the people own the government. The reason Winston Churchill loved that document, and he quoted it all the time, did you know? He thought it was the purpose of the British Empire. He thought it was the reason the British Empire had survived, because it had learned from us that it had to be like that. He would give speeches about that all the time. And you know, it was true of the British Empire, because in the First and Second World Wars, Britain's power in the wars was expanded by about 40% by troops from the empire, and the British Parliament had no power to conscript any single one of them. See, he would say they are our kith and kin across the oceans, and they acted like that. Something united them. Churchill said the only thing that could do that was the Declaration of Independence, and secondarily, the love of the Queen. Everybody loves the Queen. I've learned to love the Queen. Married to a woman who loves the Queen. So you could call that the final cause of America. And the final cause of a thing, what's the final cause of an acorn? It's to become that thing that they're, if you like trees, I happen to like them a lot, then when you see one fully grown, you say, oh yeah, that's what it's been doing all this time, to become that. And then it makes you a little sad when you think of it. We have a tremendous maple tree in front of our house. You might have seen a picture of it. It's really great. And it's just perfectly situated, and it is massive. And my wife, who's a gardener, tells me it's dying. Because she could just look up, and she's a gardener, right? So she looks up in the top and sees this little thing and that little thing. It's going to take a long time for it to die. But the first time she said that to me, do you see what that means? It means that every living thing ends in decay. And I said, we have to stop that. She said, we can't. I said, well, we might give up on it, but first we're going to get the world's greatest expert to come and tell us how to save that tree. And we've had some in, and they say it's going to last a long time, but it's going to die. Think of that phenomenon. It means that the essence of a thing is really what tells you what it is. Because if the decay of a thing was the definition of a thing, then we would be exactly the same thing as oak trees. But it's when we're fully ourselves, with all the elements, that we are at our excellence. And the Declaration of Independence is beautiful because it protects that. You can be born, to the Queen of Sheba. And Thomas Jefferson thought that didn't give you the right to rule anybody. Think what he wrote to the King of England, George III, who rode to work in a gold carriage, And he writes in the Summary View of the Rights of British North America, 1774. And you can read all these pamphlets we do at the college. Many of them are in our Constitution reader. You can read them. And that lead to the American Revolution. And they get stronger and stronger and stronger while they go. Because, we get mad. We're about to start hurting people. And you can tell it's intense when Thomas Jefferson starts writing. And he writes this thing called the Summary View, the Rights of British North America. And the end of it, right at the end, he has this paragraph and it begins like this. And he's talking, understand, to the strongest man in the world. Let those flatter who fear. It is not an American art. So in other words, Almighty King, I got nothing good to say about you. And I don't need anything. You see, that spirit, don't tread on me, that beckons every one of us to become fully human. We all get the chance. It's what we're made to be. We get to grow. And I said before, we are so much responsible for our growth. that we're just not going to come out the same. We don't start with the same natural advantages. That's an important point. But a more important point is that we do not make the same use, each one of us, of what we've got. And the ones who do make the best use, they become like those two girls I've noticed walking around here. Look at them. And I knew them when they were freshmen. And now they're women. And they're awesome. You see? And we have a right to that. And so the greatness of America is almost all in that. And then you just have to add one more thing. And see, I'm talking about conservatism. Once you hear that stated, don't you, of course, want to conserve that? Because that's conserving the thing as it is, what it means, what it has always meant. And it helps that the thing is old. That kind of argument is much older than the American Revolution, although only fully realized in the American Revolution for the first time. It helps that it's old. But of course, the decisive thing about it, and the reason it's weathered all the storms of time, is because it's true. And it carries the proof of itself in its own terms. That's what it means to be self-evident. All you got to know is just say, all it means is, if a thing is a man, it's a man. And it's the same as everything else that's a man. But that makes it radically different from a horse. Not enough to have a purpose. Final cause, when you want to know what the final cause of thing, you could always find out by asking the question, toward what does it move? What does it love? The reason we can save this country, by the way, is because we still love those things. And we get terribly confused about what they mean. But they're there, and we love them, and they're not that hard to read. And that means if you think about them, a great recovery is possible. And I believe bound to happen. In fact, maybe underway right now. The other cause that matters about America more than any other is the formal cause. That is to say, how does it work? And the way that America works is also simple to know and also traceable to a particular date. The date is September 17, 1789. That's right, 1776, 1787 is when the Constitution was passed out of the convention, and it was ratified finally in the fall to go into effect in the fall of 1789. And the Constitution is about 5,000 words, and you can read it, and it sets up how the government will proceed or function, and therefore what it will look like. And it's understood. If you read the middle of the Declaration of Independence, when they make the complaints about the king in the middle, what they're saying there is, if you interfere with the legislature, if you mix up all the powers of government in a single set of hands, if you interrupt the trial by jury, if you interfere with freedom of the press, then that's bad, and that's legitimate grounds for rebellion. And so, of course, just put that in positive terms, and you've got the Constitution of the United States, which divides the powers among three branches, and that the most popular branch is where all of the important legislation has to stop, which keeps it closer to us, and yet we are restrained also by the operation of the Constitution because it takes time to make big changes, and we have to decide more than once to make them. You see? So the form is related to the final cause, the thing we love. It's for human beings who are the most divine beings on earth and yet not divine. So we must assemble power, but we must restrain its growth. Now, I made the judgment when the primary was over. I actually made it before the primary was over, but I decided not to get involved in the primary. I was on the radio a lot with Hugh Hewitt, and we decided to be in Switzerland. I had to call him one night and remind him because he got out of hand. I've been thinking about all this for years. And then the astonishing thing happened that I decided Donald Trump might be a good thing. Now, the issue for me was least trade. And I'll tell you why about that. Winston Churchill was a free trader and Lincoln was a protectionist, and so I don't think that it's written in the natural law about that exactly. Although people ought to be able to trade where they want to in general. Better if you do it that way. And in my little opinion, if you let the government allocate where resources go, all that you do that, you're going to have more government. And that's the problem these days. Now, should we let the economy develop to the state where we can't make a nuclear weapon or an airplane? Of course not. And here's the thing about all these trade agreements that I very much agree with Mr. Trump about, and that is, if you just go read NAFTA, I mean, first of all, set aside a week. What those big trade agreements do is they make subject to international agreements massive regulatory bureaucracies. This is specifically the process by which the European Union became the sprawling, expensive, intrusive, and perfectly unaccountable thing that it has become. It grew out of a bunch of trade agreements. And they just kept adding and adding and adding. I think they may have 80,000 people in Brussels whose job is to monitor free trade. I wouldn't sign agreements like that. I like the bilateral ones better and think there ought to be a lot of them. And I think they ought to be minimal. And I think they ought to empower their governments against their people in agreements with one another. So I very much agree with that. What about immigration? I think that anyone, in principle, is an American, but no one has a right to be that. Everybody has their rights, his rights, their rights, but nobody has a right to enter any other country. An interesting argument from the American Revolution and from John Locke is everybody has a right to leave a country. So the despotism of the Soviet Union was nowhere more apparent than in the Berlin Wall, the purpose of which was to keep people in. A wall to keep people out, that might be a good idea, like now, for example. But then the welfare state complicates immigration a lot, and you got to look to that. But above all, if this final and formal cause defines what it is to be an American, then in principle, you can't be an American except you're in agreement with those things. The practices and beliefs of free government are necessary to free citizenship. So we should have rules that people who come in should have that. Like rules about ability to make a living is a great start. You know, the Canadian system, which is more or less copied in the Cotton Bill that couldn't pass the Senate 10 days ago in a terrible thing. We should have some immigration laws that filter for people who would live the way Americans are supposed to live, free, self-reliant, and respectful of the rights of others. But then I come to the big thing, and it's really big. It's the most important thing. And the reason is, it's the most urgent thing. It's what Kim talked about last night. We have changed both the form and the final cause of our government. It's extraordinary what has happened. The first power of government is to make the laws. And we don't make the laws in the same way anymore. And it's grotesque how big the difference is. In the Congress that ended 2 years ago, year and a half ago, 300 laws passed in 2 years, 150 a year. That's about the average since Hector was a pup in America. But in the last year of the Obama administration, 87,000 pages were added to the Federal Register. Now think about that. In the British Parliament, in the British Parliament, I read, they actually pass about 15 or 20% fewer laws in the Parliament than they did in 1750. And the thing is, it still works kind of the same way, and there's a process and it takes a long time, and their productivity is not very good. Thank God for it. So with the Congress, right? And that means that you couldn't have the centralized management of everything in the land if you made the laws in the old way. And so we don't. Now they're made by these regulatory agencies. That's a different form of government. It works in a different way. And by the way, can you name 30 of those agencies? Can you name how many there are? I look it up once in a while, and it's somewhere around 150 to 175. Rule-making regulatory agencies, all of which, by the way, also enforce the laws they make and hear disputes adjudicated. Employees of the same agency do all three of those things, you see. But when I say 150 to 75, when you look it up, you'll find that there's often disagreements from authoritative sources about how many there are. And often in those sources, there'll be an admission that they're kind of hard to count. That's a different kind of thing. And its purpose is to manage the society in detail so as to perfect it. But perfectibility is not one of the attributes of the human being. That's what God would be, who appears 4 times in the Declaration of Independence. And he alone would hold all the powers of government in his hand. In the Declaration, he's the supreme judge of the world, the judge, the maker of the laws of nature, and nature's God, the legislator, divine providence, the executive branch, and the creator, which is like constitution maker. And only he, right? Because we can't be perfect. And the attempt to make us perfect would have to place powers in the hands of governors who are also imperfect beings. That's the crisis. When I found out that Donald Trump on January 28, 2016, published an article in the Reno, Nevada Gazette called The Bureau of Land Management and the Rule of Law. And I came across it. Somebody sent it to me, maybe Doug. And I read it, and it's beautiful. It actually is beautiful. He understands the rule of law. Madison writes in The Federalist, if the laws be so voluminous and changeable that people cannot keep up with them, then it doesn't matter how they're made. They're still not the rule of law. Well, now they're not made by the right process anymore, and there's so many that you could never read them. And that means that when they're applied, all of the power is in the hands of the people who have the power to apply them. And if you take that on, next thing you know, the FBI is going to be against you. And I think that's just a partisan thing. I think it's thought to be indecent and backward to think that we should observe the old forms and purposes of government. I think that is understood to be a defiance against progress, and therefore a cruelty and an inhumanity to all the people who can benefit from the therapeutic state. And so when I saw that he'd taken that on, I thought, wow. I'd already come to think that he might win because he was so bold. And people would say to me, how can you believe anything he says? And I said, well, remember, it's a questionable thing. Nobody except he has ever been elected president of the United States as his first significant public service. You think I haven't been skeptical about that? And then, you know, he does praise himself an awful lot. And he's not as artful about it as Churchill was. Like one time, a lady said to Winston Churchill, Mr. Churchill, we are all worms. And he said, yes, ma'am, I am a glowworm. That's better, right? and you know, so people would say to me, you love Winston Churchill. How can you vote for Trump? And I said, wow, I missed that. Is Churchill in the race? So I'll summarize my point just with this. We are in a contest about the nature of the nation and the nature of the human being. Those are inextricably linked because the nation is founded on claims about what it is to be a human being, claims that I argue are true and beautiful. And so if you change that and you set out to change the human being, you're turning what was a representative government into an engineering project. And we're in the middle of a vast conflict about that today. And the heart of it is this regulatory state. And I don't know any more about the future than you do. And I don't know Donald Trump very well. I know him a little. But I will say I admire what he's doing, and I have hope for it. And especially in this area of the regulatory state, I wish him every good thing. Thank you.
Thank you, President Arnn. We have some time for questions. We have 2 students with microphones. Please wait for the microphone. Raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll bring it over to you.
There's the girls.
Dr. Arnn, you promised some comfort for those of us who felt some distress at the prior speaker. Could you comment about that, please?
Mr. Krine's a great guy. And what I think is, I think that I believe in limited government, right? And so I believe that the purposes of the government are listed in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. And you would regulate trade only toward those purposes. And one of them is not deciding what industries prosper. Although, for national security purposes, you might do quite a lot of that. Another thing you might do is, what? The Chinese are, very aggressive. Have you noticed? And they're just, they think that they're going to found a trade zone, they're well along, that goes from the Horn of Africa up to the east coast of Asia, and then across southern Europe to the Mediterranean, and that they're going to dominate the world. It looks terribly like Japan's Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. And so I'd keep an eye on that, and if I got the sense that they were trying to bankrupt some industry of strategic importance, I'd put a stop to that if I could. But I don't believe in general that, I don't know what's going to happen about manufacturing, but it doesn't take nearly as many people to do it. I also think, so does that help? And I'll add one more point. Because the nation, politically, talk about politics for a minute, right? And if there's this elite, we have an aristocracy now. And, James Comey is about to teach an ethics course at some college. And Doug Jeffrey said, and it's alleged on good authority that he applied for a warrant to survey an American citizen who was a volunteer to a political campaign without disclosing important facts that would undercut the justification of the warrant. I think that might not be ethical. And so, Doug Jeffrey sent me a note and said, glad he's already got a gig because we probably wouldn't be having him. Yeah, so, but about the politics of the country, right? If you get a region that's laid waste to, you know, Michigan, those places, they're recovering, by the way, but politicians should pay a lot of attention to that. And the economy is not as flexible as it used to be because, you know, we're in debt up to our ears, and we're regulated out the bazoo, and the welfare state is an impediment to work. And so we should work on those things. Like a great thing to do, in my opinion, would be to take all the Rust Belt states and turn them into what the Chinese did, right? Free enterprise zones, you know. And there's a lot of ideas about inner cities, like there's a way to fix the schools, you know, because it turns out it's not rocket science to run a school, it's just hard to do. And if you could get that straightened out, and you could get those schools good in the inner city, and it does cost more money than the average school to do that well, we discover by experience, then you should focus on that, and you should pay attention to regions and peoples in the country who get hurt by changes in the economy, and you should find a healthy way to help those people. That's what I think.
Dr. Arnn, could you comment on the current Convention of States movement? My state of Ohio it's currently in the legislature. We hope it's passed. Several states have already passed it. And I think the ostensible goal would be spending limits and term limits in Congress. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Ooh, I have detailed thoughts on that. How many are for that? Yeah, you're all wrong. So first of all, it is a clear provision in Article 5 of the Constitution that can be done. And so, of course, it's a constitutional thing to undertake. God bless you. Here are some reasons why it might not be the right thing to do. One is the Constitution has been amended, 28 times? There are two ways to amend it. That's one of them. That's the one that's never worked. Second, spending and term limits address symptoms of the problem, not the cause of the problem. The cause of the problem is in what I said. We've changed the form of the government, and that's what liberates it to do all that it does. And a very damaging part of what it does is the cost it imposes on the society, and also the attitude of nervousness and subservience it imposes on the society through the activities of the regulatory state. And those are not addressed there. Third, I don't think that in this day and age we're likely to be as good at writing constitutions as the people who wrote the great one. And so why isn't it the right thing to do to return to that one? And finally, I have chosen to spend my life learning about that one and seeking its restoration. And so I don't want to put a huge amount of energy into an effort to alter it.
We have time for just one more question.
I have one sort of question for the previous speaker, which I didn't get to, which was what about, let's say, the pharmaceutical industry, which apparently is doing just fine and is not exactly declining. So that's one point against him. But as far as the government, I believe that the free societies have won all of the conflicts of the past, and here we still stand, all of us, whereas all of these dictatorships and ideologies that relied on the single guiding principle that they had, they thought, like Nazi Germany or Soviet Union, are down in the dust. So I hope that that will prove to be the case in the future. And I agree with you that the less government we have, the better off we would be, because a lot of the failures that we see is because of the interference of government in everyday lives of people and in the industry and the regulation of the industry.
Okay, thank you. So I'm feeling contrary, so I'll disagree with that. So first of all, it is a fact that free governments have natural advantages against despotisms. But if you look at the Great Wars, very often the body count is very high. And if you look at the Second World War, not clear that we would have won that without the monstrous tyranny of the Soviet Union. And that thing lasted for 2 generations, right? So a lot of danger in the world. It'd be right to pay attention to that. The second point is, I don't believe myself that less government is always better. I think you have to have the right kind. So it's actually true, it's just a fact, that the Constitution of the United States was written to make a stronger central government. And the reason they thought they needed that, if you read Madison in our Constitution Reader, Vices of the Political System, states were violating people's rights. They were debasing their currency so you didn't have to pay their debts. They were voiding mortgages. There were mobs that were taking things out of stores. Law and order was breaking down. And so the Constitution was written to get a strong central government for national purposes, checked by strong state governments for local purposes, and vice versa. And then we to be checked too. So the size of the thing is obviously way out of scale now. And if you went at it with a machete and hacked away, you'd go a long time before you did any damage to anything worth it. But it's also true, though, that we have to remember that we need good laws, and just doing what we say is not always the way to get those, and that's why the Constitution has the checks and balances in it that it needs. And another thing, in those big wars, I think in World War II, the federal government got to be 70%, round numbers, of the whole economy. And then Bert Folsom, our faculty member, has written a very good book about this. And then 10 years after the war, it was back down to 16%. Well, what were they spending all that money on? We built, the Soviet army was rolling on trucks we sent to it, and the parts and the designs for their tanks, which were the best tanks, many of the parts and all the designs came from us. And so we were a tremendous engine to overwhelm the Germans and the Japanese. So that was a time when a small government might have cost us everything. So the point is, I agree in general with what you said. And I do think that the chief engine of prosperity is just exactly like what I said, is the chief engine of learning, and that is us working. And we have a right to do so. Thanks.